Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the Sabbath hours that are coming and for this week and all the blessings of it, for the light that you've given us and for the way that you work in our lives, that you're there each day speaking to us, guiding us, comforting us. And especially as we approach the difficulties ahead, we are thankful for this time that we have to have peace. And we're thankful so much that we can study together. May your Holy Spirit be here as we look at Sister White's visions from the Civil War. We just ask, Lord, that you can guide us and help us to understand these things. And we pray this and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I do have them on a diagram here, and I'm going to throw the diagram up, but then I'm going to draw it out again. Just because I'll sort of go over it as a summary, and then we will look at it in drawing it out, just because we need to, I think, draw it out to really get a look at it. So Ellen White had 3 Civil War visions. And the first one, and can you see the chart well, both of you?
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody can see this. I'm going to make it a little...
Yeah, I can see it well.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's
a little better. Okay, so I will bring this here.
Take off the blue, maybe. I want to get a screenshot.
That off in a second here. Just
okay.
So now I have these markers here: time of the end, 9/11, midnight cry, Sunday law, and you'll see why in a minute as we go through this. So Ellen White had this first Civil War vision on January 12th, 1861. And it wasn't recorded, like she didn't write it down at the time, but it was recorded by Joseph Bates, who was there. And I believe, it was either Bates or Loughborough. I can't remember. It might have been Loughborough. Yeah, Heidi says it was Loughborough. So he was there, and he took note of it and wrote about it through a period of time. Now, what happened in that vision was she, and I should have more details here because I can't remember all the details. I have them in the notes. And I don't know if I can send this to you as well, because I don't think I sent this to you. I did put it on my, recently put it on my academia site. But she was at an opening of a church or a dedication of a church on Sabbath. And this was January 12th. And she said that many of the people there, they would lose sons in this war that was going to happen. Now, the war she was talking about was the American Civil War. And that didn't begin until April 12th, so 3 months later. So she was prophesying of a war that had not yet happened. But what had happened is some of the states began to secede from the Union. And I can't remember which the first one was. It is in the notes. But the first one had done it a few days or a little while before. And then just before this, 3 more states seceded from the Union. But she wouldn't have known that. She would only have known in the one state because it took time for news to travel. And so she wouldn't have been aware of what had happened in the last couple of days. It would have taken a bit longer for her to know about that. But she just said that there was going to be a civil war, that it was going to be a long war, and that many of the people would lose sons in that battle. And Loughborough took note of this, wrote about it, and he also kept track of the families in that church and found that she was correct in regard to that effect. Now, so you can see on this chart, it's 90 days from her first vision to when the war commences. And it's interesting that the date on the biblical calendar that the war commenced was the first day of the first month. And we know that the first day of the first month is a symbol of 9/11. So 9/11 is also typified in Millerite history by the first day of the first month. And it's interesting, these spans of time, as you will see as we look at them. So the next one is July 21st, 1861. Now, this was a study that Heidi found. She was reading Ellen White's book, or the book on Ellen White called Woman of Vision. And in there, she was reading about Ellen White's Civil War visions, specifically the Battle of Manassas. Now, it's also called the Battle of Bull Run. The Confederate Army, they would name the battles after I can't remember, it's either the nearest city or the nearest body of water, and vice versa. Whatever they did, the Union would name it after something else. So I think Bull Run is a creek, and Manassas is the area. And Heidi says yes, that's the case. So the Battle of Manassas was based on the Union's naming of the battle, but it's also called the First Battle of Bull Run. And Bronwyn, when she mentions this, she also talks about the Second Battle of Bull Run, and both of these, Stonewall Jackson was the general in both of these battles. Now, the reason why I put this as midnight is the date there is July 21st, 1861. So you can see we have a symbol for midnight for this Battle of Manassas. The biblical date is the 12th day of the third month, so it doesn't line up with in 1844. The biblical dates aren't lining up with these dates as they because this is a different year, so they line up differently. For instance, the first day of the first month is April 12th, where in Millerite history, the first day of the first month was April 19th. So you can see it's like a week behind. So we have this Battle of Manassas on July 21st, 1861. And then we have Ellen White's second Civil War vision. And so I'm going to go to the notes. Here I have to change how I view this because I have to flip this sideways. So I have to go to view. And then go back. So I'll just go back here to some of the notes. And we're going to see how some of these things apply. So her first vision occurred on January 12, 1861, 90 days before the beginning of the war on April 12, 1861. So January 12th to April 12th. Her second vision, which we will address first, was on August 3rd, 1861, 113 days after the start of the war, and exactly 29 weeks after her first vision. Her third and final vision occurred 51 weeks after her first vision on January 4th, 1861. So the fact that these visions all occurred on Sabbath and they occur in these pattern of weeks is quite interesting. So we actually started in our presentation dealing with the Battle of Manassas. And the reason why it caught Heidi's attention is when Ellen White describes this, she had a vision where she saw that an angel intervened in this battle. The Northern Army lost in this battle, and so that's one of the things that starts to become interesting as we look at the King of the North and the King of the South. We can see this in American history, and the North was the more powerful army and should have won this battle, but they went in with so much confidence, but they would have been mowed down if an angel hadn't intervened. So the angel intervened and caused a spontaneous retreat of the Union Army, which historians still have a hard time explaining what happened. But when we see, and at this time when Ellen White's writing about it, she's writing about it, not long after it happens. At that time when you're in the middle of the war, it's hard to know what event is a pivotal event, what event is important. Always whatever the latest news is seems to be the most important. But she recognized that this was a turning point early on in the war. And some people still look at this as one of the major reasons for a lot of things that happened later on in the war between the North and the South. So she had this vision, and I'm going to read it here. So it's pretty interesting. I had a view of the late disastrous battle at Manassas, and VA means
Virginia.
Yeah, I always get mixed up with the American things, but they're abbreviations of their states. It was a most exciting, thrilling, distressing scene. The Southern Army had everything in their favor and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern Army was moving on with triumph, not doubting, but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. As they neared the battlefield, many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little would have been driven back still further. Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Instantly, there was confusion in their ranks. It appeared to the Northern men that their armies were retreating, when it was not in reality so, and the precipitate retreat commenced. It seemed wonderful to me. Then it was explained that God had this nation in his own hand and would suffer no victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and no more losses to the Northern men than in his wisdom he saw fit, to punish the North for their sin. And in this battle, had the Northern army pushed the battle still further, in their fainting, exhausted condition, a far greater struggle and destruction awaited them, which would have caused great triumph in the South. God would not permit this and sent an angel to interfere. The sudden falling back of the Northern troops was a mystery to all. They knew not that God's hand was in the matter. So we're going to look at some of the eyewitness accounts of what happened. So we're going to look at W.W. Blackford. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Southern Army and was at the Battle of Manassas on July 21st, 1861. It was now about 4 o'clock, and the battle raged with unabated fury. The lines of blue were unbroken, and their fire vigorous as ever, while they surged against the solid walls of gray, standing immovable in their front. It was on that ridge earlier in the day that Jackson won the name of Stonewall. But now the most extraordinary spectacle I have ever witnessed took place. I had been gazing at the numerous well-formed lines as they moved forward to the attack, some 15 or 20,000 strong in full view, and for some reason had turned my head in another direction for a moment when someone exclaimed, pointing to the battlefield, "Look, look!" I looked, and what a change had taken place in an instant. Where those well-dressed, well-defined lines with clear spaces between had been steadily pressing forward, the whole field was a confused swarm of men, like bees, running away as fast as their legs could carry them, with all order and organization abandoned. In a moment more, the whole valley was filled with them as far as the eye could reach. They plunged through Bull Run, so Bull Run was the water, right? That was the creek, wherever they came to it, regardless of fords or bridges, and there many drowned. Muskets, cartridge boxes, belts, knapsacks, haversacks, and blankets were thrown away in their mad race, that nothing might impede their flight. In the reckless haste, the artillery drove over everyone who did not get out of their way. Ambulance and wagon drivers cut the traces and dashed off on the mules. In their crossing Cub Run, shell exploded in the team and blocked the way, and 28 pieces of artillery fell into our hands. Now we have a account of Brother Johnson, and he had been among the Confederate forces, and this is what he told J.N. Loughborough. I stood not 4 rods from General Beauregard when the stampede began. Beauregard had their cannons loaded with chain shot and was about to fire. He looked toward the advancing host and cried out, "The Yanks are all retreating. Don't fire the guns." Brother Johnson said, "Had they fired the charge, they would have mowed everything down before them to the earth." And that's from the Pacific Union Record, March 21st, 1912. So we have an account where Ellen White says that if the angel had intervened, there would have been this great loss of the northern men. We can see here why that was. So basically, the South would have mowed down many, many men, and it would have been much worse if the North hadn't retreated. It would have been worse for them. So very interesting part of it. Now, as I said, Ellen White's vision occurred only 13 days after the Battle of Manassas. While the significance of any battle is usually understood long after the fact, Ellen White was given insight not only to the significance of this battle, but also into heaven's interest and attention to these events. The interest was due to the sin of slavery for which God was punishing the nation. So there's this whole history when you read about Ellen White's visions. She's talking about why God is, for one, Abraham Lincoln had called for these fasts or prayer days, to pray for the northern armies. And Ellen White said that we should not participate in those because the nation had not recognized their sin. So they were just as much responsible for the crime of slavery as was the South. And so initially, like we have in history where it's all about, Abraham as opposed to slavery, but really it wasn't as simple as that. Abraham Lincoln was, he may have personally been opposed to slavery, but many people in the North weren't happy with this war. But a lot of it had to do with the state powers. So there was this argument over state powers, and that's really where the main issue was. So many people who were on the North were in favor of slavery. They just didn't want the South to secede. They wanted the Union to be maintained. So this is her her vision, what she says about it. God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influences. All heaven beholds the indignation. Human beings, the workmanship of God, reduced to the lowest depths of degradation and placed on a level with the brute creation by their fellow men. And she says later, God will restrain his anger but a little longer. His anger burns against this nation, and especially against the religious bodies who have sanctioned and have themselves engaged in this terrible merchandise. So it's something that, at least I have a hard time really understanding, what went on. I mean, I've seen documentaries and so forth. But the fact that Christians would support the way people were being treated kind of amazes me. So she says, at the Roosevelt Conference, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, Sabbath, August 3rd, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery. So this was a time when they were praying. I was shown that many realize not the extent of the evil which has come upon us. They have flattered themselves that the national difficulties would soon be settled and confusion and war end. But all will be convinced that there is more reality in the matter than was anticipated. Many have looked for the North to strike a blow and the controversy be ended. So a lot of people thought that this was going to be a very short war, that basically the North would just conquer the South. So this idea that it was going to be a long war, Ellen White had right from the beginning. But many people did not even believe there was going to be a war initially. They just thought the North would come and show their force and the South would give in. I was pointed back to ancient Israel held in bondage by the Egyptians. The Lord wrought by Moses and Aaron to deliver the children of Israel. Miracles were performed before Pharaoh to convince him that they were especially sent of God to bid him to let Israel go. And of course, this whole idea that the Israelites were slaves, we should obviously be opposed to slavery. And then she says in this paragraph here, this highlighted, this scene was presented before me to illustrate the selfish love of slavery, the desperate measures the South would adopt to cherish the institution, and the dreadful lengths to which they would go before they would yield. Their consciences have become seared and hardened, as was Pharaoh's, and if compelled to release their slaves, their principles are unchanged, and they would make the slave feel their oppressive power if possible. It looked to me like an impossibility now for slavery to be done away. God alone can wrench the slave from the hand of his desperate, relentless oppressor. All the abuse and cruelty exercised toward the slave is justly chargeable to the upholders of the slave system, whether they be Southern men or Northern men. And so this idea, when we look at this issue of slavery, in this context, God was, judging the nation, the United States. Even though they had in their constitution about freedom, there's obviously a class of people that weren't free. And this comparison then to Egypt is obviously an important comparison, as she says. There's another point I was thinking of here that I can't remember what it is. It'll probably come back to me later. Oh, that was what it is. When we look at, what Ellen White, when she talks about there's going to be a civil war in America again, and it's going to be this time the rich against the poor, we can definitely see a parallel with what was happening there and what's happening now. To me, that's really evident. Even though we're just dealing with plague, we're still dealing with people being oppressed, with the government trying to control individuals. And we've traded one kind of slavery for another kind of slavery. It maybe doesn't have chains, but still Americans have traded their freedom for a sense of safety, even though there is no real safety. And a few things here I'm just going to skip. So then I go back to the first vision, and I mentioned this. So this is the one where it says, she says, in this vision I have seen large armies of both sides gathered on the field of battle. So this is a vision she had 90 days before the war began. I heard the booming of the cannon and saw the dead dying on every hand. Then I saw them rushing up engaged in hand-to-hand fighting. Then I saw the field after battle, all covered with dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons and saw the suffering of those in want who were wasting away. Then I was taken to the homes of those who had lost husbands, sons, or brothers in the war. I saw their distress and anguish. Then, surveying her audience, Ellen slowly added a foreboding note. There are those in this house who will lose sons in that war. So, a pretty remarkable account. And so it was South Carolina that had seceded in December 20th, 1861. And then 3 days before her Parkville vision, so this was at the Parkville Church, a domino progression of states began to secede from the Union. So just before this vision, on January 12th, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama all had seceded from the Union. So she wouldn't have known. She might have known about the one in Mississippi, January 9th, but it's very unlikely she would have known about the one on the 10th and the 11th. It would have taken too long for news to get to her. But she sees that this is going to happen. And she only mentions South Carolina earlier on. So she says right at the top of the page, people are making sport of the secession ordinance of South Carolina, but I've been just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state, and there will be a most terrible war. So it's most likely she actually never heard about Mississippi or Florida or Alabama at the time she had that vision. So I list all those there with the biblical dates that they secede from the Union and, of course, the Gregorian dates. Now, her third vision is interesting, and I'm not going to go through this one. But she just goes on and she's talking. It's in the review article in the review headed The Nation. So she's talking about the situation that was happening at that time. And this was what was going to happen if the North did not change their viewpoint. And we'll look at that in a minute here. So she's talking about the pro-slavery and the people against it and so forth. So I'm not going to go through this whole vision because it's pretty long. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this line again and flip this. Well, what I'll do is maybe draw it, but I just got to flip it so I can see it. So I can draw it because I can't remember all the dates on it. Okay, so as we said, we have her first vision, which is January 12th, 1861. And then we have this 90 days to when the war begins on April 12th. And the biblical date here, of course, as I pointed out, is the first day of the first month. So to me, to put this on a line, I chose to make this the time of the end and this to be 9/11, so the parallel there. Now, to say that this is the time of the end, we would just say that there's this period of darkness and God's going to give an increase of light. And that light is going to be Ellen White's first Civil War vision. Then we have the war begin. So she has this vision, and then we have this war start. And then we're going to have 100 days until the Battle of Manassas. So that's going to be on July 21st, 1861. And because of the date, it seemed to be obvious that that should be considered midnight. And then there's going to be 13 days, which is, of course is a symbol of rebellion. And then you're going to have Ellen White's second vision. So you got her first vision over here and her second vision here, where she addresses this battle 13 days earlier. And that's August 3rd, 1861. And I labeled this the Midnight Cry. Now, whether that's the correct labeling of it or not, that's just how I chose to do it based on the fact it's the next waymark. And these are a doubling. So, you know, have the battle and then you have Ellen White's vision regarding that battle. And then we're going to have 22 weeks, which is 154 days. And it's 22 weeks. And 22 weeks is a symbol of 220, or a number of restoration. And then we're going to have Ellen White's third vision. And this vision is on January 4th, 1862. And then there's going to be a bunch of stuff here that I don't have enough room for. But the war is going to end on May 9th, 1865. Now, so I probably could have moved that over a little bit. But this becomes important. She has these three visions. And it's this period of time in here where she gives this warning or this test that she gives, and I'm going to call it the Sunday Law. So to me, her vision is presenting this test for the United States. And what we're going to have is we're going to have Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Now, that's not going to happen for a whole year, basically. That's going to happen on January 1st. So on January 1st, 1863, is when we have this major change that the North gives this proclamation and frees all the slaves. So they have this proclamation that they're all going to be free. Now, in this vision here, Ellen White talks about these. This is where she talks about these fasts that Lincoln has proposed, prayer and fasting days, that she says not to participate in because the United States is endorsing or supporting slavery. And when this Emancipation Proclamation occurs, he also calls a day of prayer and fasting, which is April 30th, 1863. So you're going to have a period here of 17 weeks. And then you're going to have this on April 30th, 1863. This is a day of prayer and fasting. And Ellen White says that we can join in that because of this Emancipation Proclamation, that when they call this prayer and fasting, then it's now acceptable because the United States has, in a sense, repented of their sin. And so she says that that's okay. And there's another Thanksgiving in there, which isn't really important in this study. But near the end of the war, they have a Thanksgiving. And then the war finally ends on May 9th, 1865. Now, this date becomes important. In our history, the date May 9th is April 26th. In that, right now, the Julian calendar is 13 days behind. So it's 13 days from April 26th to May 9th. But the Julian calendar has this date, which we know we take as a symbol of the 26th day of the fourth month. So it's interesting that it ended with this symbol, even though it's May 9th. And we also have May 9th showing up in our lives in various places. So May 9th also becomes a symbol that's related to April 26th. And I'm not sure the purpose of it. I know it's related to this, but it also has to do with other things that we put in our lives that I'm not going to have time to go through. But so we can take these dates, we can see how they're all significant. One is to the span of time, 154 days in Samuel Snow's letters, depending on how you count it, from the beginning of his first letter to July 18th, I usually count it as 153 days. But 154 would be a count if you counted the first day and you counted it orderly, it would be 154 because it's divided to periods of 77 days. But the other thing about this is you can see 154 is 77 plus 77. And we know that 77 is a symbol of Trump. Trump has this number attached to him. And you can also see the fact it's 22 weeks, which is also a doubling. So this period I take as the midnight cry because of that. So these 22 weeks and 154 days have this symbol in it. And that's why I put the midnight cry here, not just that it follows midnight. So I'm doing this just kind of as an introduction to get some background on the Civil War before we look at Bronwyn's study. Now, Bronwyn's going to use, of course, these dates, 1861 as the start of the war. And then she's going to look at 1863 in the center of the war. And obviously the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, I think would be the event that would mark 1863 for me, because obviously January 1st marks it. And then the war ends on May 9th, 1865. So you'll see that as we go through her lines. So is there any question about these lines so far, what I've done here with the Civil War? Before I erase it, any comments on it? Any questions? Make sense? Doesn't make sense?
I think it makes sense.
Okay, you think it makes sense? Okay. So even these waymarks then, where I place them, make sense to you?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense to me. You know, that's why we came to those conclusions. Now, it was interesting that, you know, even though we put this line up here on the Civil War, that the new movement, they started to use the Civil War, but they started to misuse it. And they were using a mixture of truth and error. So they did recognize some things about the war, but they weren't focused on the visions, Ellen White's visions and this structure and the significance of it. And I don't know if they knew about it. They had opportunity a little bit because I did send out the paper to people, but you know, they obviously just totally ignored this really. But when they dealt with the Civil War, they recognized that there was this issue of slavery, but they tried to make the argument that there was no Sunday law being talked about in the Spirit of Prophecy at this time. And it's true that she wasn't talking about a Sunday law prior to the close of probation. When she talked about a Sunday law, it was always after the close of probation. And so there's probably a bit of truth in the idea that the test here in this history was not initially going to be about Sunday. And I think that's an important point, though, is that when Sunday does show up, it doesn't necessarily show up as the main point initially. Other issues arise, pandemics, things like that. But they set the stage for the Sunday law. And I think that's really what would have happened in this history if, you know, if things were different, how different they would have to be for all these things to come about. I don't know. I don't know what the conditions would be that would have created the churches to control the state. But it didn't happen in this history, so it's kind of hard to say what if. But Ellen White does basically say that the nation would be judged if they didn't repent of slavery. And so things would have led eventually to oppression and the Sunday law. I just don't know how that would have happened. You know, I can't describe what conditions would have arisen for that to occur. Okay, so now Bronwyn brought up a really important point. So I'm going to erase this here, and I'm going to try to illustrate her lines. Doing it mostly by memory, even though I have her notes here. But if I remember correctly, she drew 3 lines, and I'm mostly concerned with the first 2, not so much the third one at this point. But we have the first line, which she's going to start in 1831, and she's going to take this period of 30 years to 1861. And then she's going to divide this period here, 1863, and then 1865. But in the middle here, she's going to now have this divided into 2 periods of 15 years. And she's going to take this year, 1846, So I know this is a little bit of a review, but and so some of this I'm not gonna like do everything that she did, but I'm gonna try to show what I saw as the relevance when she presented it that she may not have seen in regard to this history here. So her focus was upon, to a large degree, upon what happened in 1846. And this is the line of Adventism. So this is Miller first giving his message. And then this is after 1844. She uses the symbols here were, I know there was, Jeff introduced some ideas as well, but I think it was basically the marriage and the Sabbath. I remember. But I know I think Jeff introduced baptism. There were some other points. I need to write better. This way. Is that correct, what she presented? Was it marriage and the Sabbath that she focused on here? I know the Sabbath for sure.
Yeah, she did. It was rebaptism, marriage, and Sabbath, as I recall.
Yeah, baptism was, Jeff, I think, introduced it, the rebaptism.
Oh, wow.
And some other point, he had introduced two other ideas, which weren't really pertinent to what she was illustrating. So I'll just leave it there. And so this chiasm, and she talks about the chiasms, how the center of this chiasm is the key that unlocks the structure, right? So, obviously we have this here, 1831 and 1861, but to really understand the relationship between this whole structure, you would need to understand what happened here in 1846. And her main point was that she learned, and you'll see it here in a minute, is that we have often looked at what's happening in the world as sort of we're following what's happening and we are in a sense reacting to these events. What she tries to illustrate, and I think very successfully, is that it's the condition of the church and what the church is experiencing that then affects what happens in the world. So here, this line here of Adventism directly impacts the United States. If Adventism does not go through this line, the United States does not go through their line. Where we sort of think the United States goes through their line and then we end up following that line. But that's not what happens. This line is the primary line. So this is God's people. Now, the line that she draws for the United States, right? Now, she talks about these different men. So she talks about William Miller and the meaning of his name and the role that he plays. And then there's this other William. I'm so bad with names. But he's an abolitionist. So he believes that slavery should be abolished. Do you guys remember his name? I can probably find it here.
I think it was William Wilberforce, but there was a Garrison she mentioned also.
Yeah, it was Garrison. That was it. Yeah, that would be. It was Garrison. William Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison. That's the person. An prominent American abolitionist, journalist, suffragist. And so she uses him because he starts this magazine called The Liberator, and that begins in 1831. So she's dealing here with Miller having this message and William Lloyd Garrison. So he has, William Miller begins to to start to publish his works and his writings, his sermons. So he has a message. And then we see here he has The Liberator is the magazine. So this magazine or this paper becomes this impetus for this, basically what happens in the United States that ends up showing up there. Now, she focuses on the center of this as well. So obviously we know that this is going to be the Civil War, where in Adventism, this is Adventism beginning to form as a church. And in 1863, of course, they become a denomination. And 1865, I don't think I remember what she dealt with in 1865 specifically. But she lays these out like that. So in here, this is obviously the end of the war, and this is the end of the war in Adventism. So there's things that are happening in Adventism that are connected here. So that's her point, but I just can't remember exactly what she points to in 1865. Now, the thing that she points in 1846, she connects to Abraham Lincoln. And in 1846, we have, this is the history of the Liberty Bell. And I wish I remembered everything that she said. So I'm going to just look at Wikipedia really quickly here to remember all the different things that occurred. So the Liberty Bell was, the thing about it is it was originally built in England, and then it was recast because it had a crack in it. And then the important date here it was rung in July 8th, 1776. So it was around for a long time. They say it wasn't rung on July 4th, 1776. And there's the whole history of the founding of it. And the important point becomes 1846, because this ends up being taken over by this abolitionist movement. And what happens on this date, that's what I should just do here. It has to do with this crack in the Liberty Bell. So it happened on Washington's birthday in February of 1846. So Washington's birthday, you have this Liberty Bell. I guess I can draw the Liberty Bell, because if Jeff can draw it, I can. Oops. And there's this crack in it that goes something like this. So you have this crack in this bell. And this happens on Washington's birthday is February 22nd, but it's actually in February 23rd that they celebrated Washington's birthday. In 1846, it was February 23rd. But still, Washington's birthday is normally February 22nd. And of course, that's an important date because that's Samuel Snow's first letter when it was published in 1844. So basically 2 years before that was the Midnight Cry message. But we can also see here that this is relating to what happened in 1846. So this crack in liberty has to do with there's a message being given to the United States, but they're beginning to reject that message. And so here, we have Miller and Garrison both giving a message to the United States, but here the United States is rejecting this message. And this crack in the Liberty Bell, and it's named after the Liberator, that's why they named it this way, but it shows, and it becomes to symbolize the separation between the races in the United States, between black and white. So, this becomes an extremely important symbol in the United States. And then, of course, we have Abraham Lincoln, who's going to come on the scene here. So with Lincoln, there's a whole other connection with Washington's birthday as well. And this has to do with his election, so I have to explain this history as well. And of course, I read it over. Abraham Lincoln. I know I shouldn't be typing these things in here. So there's the presidential election, and I know there's a connection here with Washington's birthday, and I'm trying to remember what it is. It's not in this article. Do any of you remember what the connection was with Washington's birthday and Lincoln? Because I can't remember it at the moment. So we have a connection, and I know it has to do with his election, and it also is related to his death as well. And that's what I don't remember. So nobody remembers. I'm just going to grab her paper. See if I can find this. So I'm just going to bring her notes up here. Let's see if we can find it on her notes. Gonna have to blow these up. Okay. So there's a bunch of preliminary stuff that she deals with that she never really presented. So we got the prelude, the marriage and the Sabbath in 1861. Okay, personal trials, systematic benevolence, the chart in 1863. She doesn't really deal with what happened in 1865. That's why I don't remember that. So we have William Lloyd Garrison that rises, and then the crack. It rendered the bell unringable on Washington's birthday, 1846. So that crack became so bad that they couldn't ring the bell anymore, and so it became an icon. The bell achieved its iconic status when abolitionists adopted the bell as a symbol for the movement. It was first used in this association as a frontispiece in 1837 edition of Liberty, published by the New York Anti-Slavery Society. So there's a bunch of interesting history that I even found after she did her presentation that she didn't present. Don't remember it all, with the buying of the bell and all that, how that all happened. So now we're going to have, so this is the point. It was in 1861. Now we know the war broke out on April 12th, 1861. And it, from April 12th to April 9th, 1865, she has, it's actually wrong. In her notes, it's May 9th, 1865. And I remember once writing that myself, and Jeff corrected me. I don't know why I didn't correct Bronwyn then, but he knows it was May 9th. So, Looking for Lincoln's Philadelphia, Personal Journey from Washington Square to Independence Hall by Bradley R. Hawk. It says here, the next morning on Washington's birthday, February 22, 1861, Lincoln and his 7-year-old son, Tad, mounted an open carriage and rode 3 blocks to Independence Hall. Scott's Legion, a group of Mexican War veterans, escorted father and son. At 7 a.m., after more than 9 years of rhetoric heavily laced with the words of the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln entered the assembly room of Independence Hall for the first time. The room was a patriotic shrine that had been redecorated by the city in 1854 and 1855. The Liberty Bell sat in the corner on an octagonal pedestal that was decorated with flags, columns, and the names of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. William Rush's sculpture of George Washington stood near the center of the east wall, flanked by portraits of William Penn and Lafayette. A chair possibly used by John Hancock during the signing of the Declaration, and a step allegedly used for the first reading of the Declaration of Independence stood along the outer walls. After welcoming remarks by the President of the Select Council, Lincoln was expected to address the waiting council members. Surely he was exhausted by the past 11 days of travel, crowds, the pushing, the shoving, and the chaos. His right hand was swollen and partially dysfunctional from shaking so many hands. Only 8 hours earlier, he had learned of a plot to assassinate him, and in an interval, he had less than 7 hours of sleep. Had he not known that he would be called upon to speak inside the hall, his speech was extemporaneous, but based on years of oratory and thought. His voice was low and barely audible. And so this is this famous speech here. I am filled with deep emotion at finding myself standing here in a place where were collected together the wisdom, the patriotism, the devotion to principle, from which sprang the institution under which we live. All the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall in which we stand. I've never had a feeling politically that they did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I've often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and adopted that Declaration of Independence. So anyway, there's a bunch there, and it says, it was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. If this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it. My friends, this is a wholly unprepared speech. I did not expect to be called upon to say a word when I came here. I supposed I was merely to do something towards raising a flag. I may therefore have said something indiscreet, but I have said nothing but what I am willing to live by, and in the pleasure of Almighty God, die by. So the point of this is that 10 days later, Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States, and his expressions of reverence for the Declaration of Independence continues throughout his years in power. And now, in November 1863, at Gettysburg, Lincoln gave the world his meditation on the destiny of a free people bound together in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, so known as the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he gave this speech in 1863, and then she has, in April 1865, Lincoln appeared at Independence Hall a final time, albeit in death. His funeral train arrived at the Broad and Prime Street station just before 5 p.m. on Saturday evening, April 22nd, 1865. So this Independence Hall and the connection to the Liberty Bell is the focus that she has. And I believe that the speech, if I remember correctly, and I'm just going to check it up. So think it was 273, that's what it is. I was thinking. I believe that the speech had 273 words delivered by Lincoln at the official dedication ceremony for the National Cemetery at the site on November 19th, 1863. So this 273 words becomes an important symbol of the message to the Levites. So this is the basic structure that I think is, now she's going to go through the Battle of Manassas and some of this other stuff. She deals with Stonewall Jackson and the second battle of Bull Run, and lots of different things here that I'm not going to address. One is the dreams of Abraham Lincoln. They're very important. So it's just kind of a simple summary, but what I want to do is talk about some of the implications about this. And so, yeah, you can all participate in any comments you may have about it. We'll look at the line again. So we know here we're going to have Independence Hall here, and that's also going to be Washington's birthday, February 22, 1861. So this is when Washington's birthday, the bell cracks, and 15 years later, Abraham Lincoln enters Independence Hall. And where the bell is. And then this is the history of the war. And of course, I think the important date in 1863, there's a lot of other dates, but I would mark it at January 1st, 1863, where you have the Emancipation Proclamation. So she's focusing upon Lincoln's address, the Gettysburg Address, because that's also an important date. So, you know, I'm not going to deny that. But again, that was so where's this here?
The top line 1863 is when the Adventist.
And that was in November. What's that?
Top line 1863 is when the Seventh-day Adventist Church became denominated.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I know this. I just don't know 1865. She didn't give an event there. So, yeah, so we have 1863. This is Adventist history. And we know, obviously, the connection with the church becoming a denomination in 1863 and the connection here as well. Now, she focuses upon the Gettysburg Address, but 1863 becomes, of course, the pivotal year in the sense he has the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st. And then in November, he gives the Gettysburg Address with the 273 words. Right? So this is the symbol of the Levites. And then, of course, we have the end of the war. So we got, you know, May 9th, 1865. But there are other events in here. And so obviously the Gettysburg Address is important, Independence Hall, and of course the assassination of Abraham Lincoln that occurs. So his assassination ends up being in April. So any thoughts on this? I need your help. Because he died April 15th, 1865. So before the war had actually ended. Though the war was virtually over by then when he was assassinated.
Whose birthday is February 22nd?
Washington. George Washington. Now, you know, another thing that could be added into here is if you look at the American Revolutionary War, it becomes, you know, it actually can be laying over top of this as well, because the Revolutionary War and the Civil War are connected. Just like the Revolutionary War in 977, BC, between the North and the South, and then the Civil War that occurs in 742 BC. So the North and the South become important symbols, and we can obviously see that in the American Civil War that the North and the South are important in that context, in typifying what's happening now. Any thoughts on this? I mean, I know this is a really quick summary of what Bronwyn presented, and I'm not presenting our line underneath this. The thing is, we can see obviously the symbol of 273 and the symbol of February 22nd, having to do with the message of the midnight and the midnight cry. So when we get to Ellen White's visions here, you know, her first vision's obviously January 12th, and then April 12th, the war begins. And so that was, how many days again? That was 90 days. And yeah, it's roughly about 41 days from her first vision to February 22nd. And then March, April. It's going to be like 50 days to, yeah, so it'd be like 49 days to the start of the Civil War. So here you have Lincoln becoming president in this line, in this history, from the time that Ellen White has her first vision to the Battle of Manassas, and then her second vision. You can see that in that period, Abraham Lincoln becomes president. So it obviously starts to change things. So this reform line here is about slavery. And so the church is acting here, but the United States is acting here. And obviously we could even go back and look at some of this. We can see that the first horn that falls, which is Protestantism, has fallen. And in part, when we think about that, many people don't know that William Miller himself was an abolitionist. He was opposed to slavery, and that movement had started with William Lloyd Garrison. And we had some of them that were actually strong abolitionists. And the one most notable would be Joshua V. Himes. So Himes was originally an abolitionist. So there's a connection, obviously, between what the Millerites were teaching and their message, and Miller had no prejudice against Black people. So there was this openness that everyone was welcome. But you can see here that this is a struggle that America is going to go through. Now, of course, we know that this isn't the end of it, because we can go to the 1960s and see that a lot of other changes occur in the United States. Because even though the slaves were freed, prejudice still continued. And just because they enshrined this in the Constitution doesn't mean it was followed. So there's obviously a change that happened here that's good, but there had to be further change. And so obviously when the Christian church fell, and the Protestants fell, then that really affected this history as well. So if the Protestants hadn't fallen, we could connect this history here, with events that are now happening. They could have happened in this history in a different way, but still the end time events would have been fulfilled. Any thoughts? Heidi, do you got any thoughts on this? It's pretty interesting. Yeah, especially in the context of what we studied. Yeah. And, we could actually draw two more lines if we really wanted to, because we can draw our reform line, and then we can draw the United States presently. It also has a line, because this is, in a sense, the beginning of two different lines, right? This is the beginning of Adventism, and this is the beginning of the United States. Not the complete beginning, but it's part of the beginning of this reform line that parallels what happens here. And so we could actually do two more lines. We could do our line, and then the United States line, and see that they're connected with what God's people are doing. So that's the study. That's as far as really what I wanted to show. It's not a very organized study. So I open it up to thoughts. I need some thoughts. I don't have a lot to say about it other than what I show. Okay, Angela?
Well, I've got this book here, Volume 3, Intellectual Movements, 1844 by Jerome L. Clark. It's got some stuff about William Lloyd Garrison in it.
Oh, okay.
I'm just kind of flipping through it. See if there's anything really interesting and pertinent.
Yeah. Well, I do know, like I did read Wikipedia's, article on him, and everything that she said about it was correct. And so there's, it's definitely interesting. The magazine, The Liberator, coming in 1831, just as William Miller begins his preaching. So, these parallels, and I think the main point, though, is that William Miller is not reacting to William Lloyd Garrison. William Miller is acting based on God's leading, but God is also, at the same time, because of what's going to be happening with God's people, he has happened in the world a parallel movement, that's addressing the sins of the United States, where in the United States is this two-horn power, right? Church and state. And the church falls in 1844. But the United States, the civil power has not fallen, even though it's in danger here because of displeasure to God. But that's not going to happen until the Sunday Law. So when the second horn falls, the state falls, republicanism falls, that's in our history. And so I think that's another interesting point to bring out, is that, obviously if the United States had fallen in this history, it could have gone away from liberty and gone into a Sunday law. And I think, I said before, I couldn't really speculate on how that would happen. But one of the things about Nashville, the Parthenon Temple in Nashville, is that it symbolized two things. It symbolized slavery and education. That was the idea behind the Parthenon. It was because this idea that the South was this educated class, and that slavery was actually an intellectual idea. There was intellectual arguments for slavery, and they were educating people to believe that slavery was a good thing. I don't know how you could do that, but that's what they did. And so this Parthenon symbolizes those two elements, education and slavery. And we can see how this then would align with this history. So even though the South loses the war, they still try to set themselves up as this intellectual society that believes in slavery. But if the South had won the war, and I think that's really where the issue would have had arisen. If the South had won the war, we would have had a very different order of things in the United States. I don't know how the South could win. So, how would they take over the North? I'm not really sure what would happen. I would think that the states probably would have devolved into a much more independent states, and you wouldn't have had so much federalism. But I'm not sure what that would mean in regard to a Sunday law. But that's my only thoughts on it. I don't know exactly how that would come about as a Sunday law. I just know that if the South had won, American history, of course, would have been very different. Dana, you got any thoughts? Or Kelly, I know, is on on the line there.
Hello, no thoughts, completely blank.
Okay.
It's the end of a long week.
Yeah, I understand. It was a long week for us too. Dana, any thoughts?
Well, I was just, Daniel Frontenot, he did that. He also talked about that war.
Mhm.
So I forget what his take on it was or what his slant was with it, but
Yeah, well, I remember he didn't address as many things as, as Bronwyn did, or even as Heidi and I did when we did our presentation on the Civil War. I mean, we know the war was pivotal, and I think he was focusing upon, the Civil War becoming a point where Adventists organized, and one of the reasons that Adventists organized was to avoid conscription into the war, so that they weren't put in as soldiers. If they had a church, they could then go as medics and things like that, but they wouldn't be involved in fighting, or they could maybe even get out of the war completely. So, I mean, that was sort of some of the reasonings behind it. But a lot of people willingly went to the war because they believed the cause was just, whether they were in the South or in the North. People who were Adventists, could end up on the opposite side of the battle. So, and I think that's kind of what he was focusing upon, was that aspect of it, which I think we all sort of know that that's why the Adventist Church organized, was partly because of the war. But what Bronwyn's point is that we often see it as the church as a reaction to what was happening, but really organization was happening already in 1860, when they chose the name Seventh-day Adventist. And we know that that's when the youngest boy died. Can't remember his name.
His name was Herbert.
Herbert, yes. Herbert. And then the older one's name was, started with an H.
Henry.
Henry. So Herbert and Henry. So, Herbert died. And, Jeff has dealt with that because you lose your youngest in the setting up of the gates. And of course, that has to do with the name. And so Herbert died in December of 1860. And then Henry died in December of 63. And that was 7 months after the church organized. It organized in May of 63. And so that was the rebuilding of Jericho. So and Jericho is a rejection of, Jericho is about the 7 times because they go around the city 7 times. And so the rebuilding of Jericho is partly the rejection of the 7 times. But there's also this organization of the church. Even though organization has to happen, it's happening because the church is not properly functioning as a movement, because the members aren't really converted. And so organization is, I wouldn't say it's God's original plan that they would organize in that way in 1863, but it was the plan at that time. They needed to organize because otherwise the movement would dissolve, it would fall apart. So organization was necessary at that time. But you can see that this war that's going on, this civil war, the church, there's events happening in the church, and these are reflected in the events happening in the world. And that's, I think, is the main point and the most important point of it. Now, just a thing about this number 273 that shows up here. I was noticing that when you have JFK is killed, he's killed on November 22nd.
Right.
And I noticed that if you go to Washington's birthday, now this is in 1963.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Washington's birthday, it's February 22nd. And the number of days between here is 273 days. So,
Whoa.
I thought that was very interesting because JFK being assassinated lines us up with Abraham Lincoln. Now, other people have noticed a lot of similarities between Lincoln
Yeah.
and JFK. And we've sort of just said, well, these are just coincidences, you know, we pick and choose. And sometimes you'll see a list of these, and some of them aren't correct. They're actually fudging things a little bit to make it look the same. But there are definitely parallels, and the most obvious one is that they're assassinated. But also just this number here connecting to Washington's birthday with the 273. And we can see here in 1863, the 273 words of the Gettysburg Address. It's given in November, not November 22nd. I can't remember, it was November 19th or something like that. But you know, you can see that there's obviously this parallel in this history. And then when we look at our line, you know, we have some interesting parallels in our line. What happens in the 60s becomes pivotal. And we know that we have an Adventist evangelist named Lewis F. Weir, who's actually predicting that the Soviet Union is going to fall based upon Daniel 11, verse 40. And he uses the argument that Daniel 11:40b is the king of the South, or the king of the North coming back against the king of the South, and the king of the North being the papacy and its army, which is the United States. So the United States and the Pope are going to combine to overthrow the Soviet Union. And so we see this in the 60s. So we definitely can connect what happens in the 60s to what happens in 1989. And I think there's two interesting books. One is, I think Lewis F. Weir first wrote about it was in 1957. I know I have a book of his from 1957 that talks about what happened in 1989. So 1957 being the beginning of the fourth generation. And then we also have, of course, the book Questions on Doctrine in 1957. And 1957 is 7 years before, well, 6 years, I guess, before 1963, but depends how you count the years, if you count it as one. You know, so you can count it as, you know, ordinally it would be 7 years. So there's definitely a connection between those what's happening in Adventism and what's happening in the world. So all the events that end up happening in this history here with Adventists and with the United States, they start again to happen, but Adventism starts to be tested because it's in the fourth generation, it's in a period of darkness. And the United States now comes back and begins to address the issue of slavery in the 60s. And, you know, we've never really placed some of these people on a line like Martin Luther King Jr. And some of these events. And I'm sure that we could probably have all kinds of studies where we deal with JFK and what happened in the 60s and what led to 1989, because there's lots of things here that happen. Well, the other book, which is 1957, is Avro Manhattan's book. I believe it's in 1957 that he wrote his book called The Vatican and World Politics. And if you read the American preface to that book, he basically lays out the argument that there's three powers that are seeking for world domination: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the papacy. And the papacy is the one that we're not watching. So Avro Manhattan says we need to be watching the papacy because it has its hand in everything that occurs. And so, you know, this is another important waymark that ends up happening, is this book by Avro Manhattan. So, so to me, there's just a lot happening. The church is putting out this book, Questions on Doctrine. We have Lewis F. Weir, who's saying that the Soviet Union is going to fall based upon Bible prophecy. And you have somebody in the world, Avro Manhattan, writing about this struggle between these three powers seeking for the control of the world. So it's very, very fascinating. And we just have not really addressed it in detail. And you know, we probably don't have enough time to do that. But maybe as time goes on, we will start to see some of these things, somebody will come, will have light on this that will help us understand where we are. But definitely what happened in the 60s is really affecting us still today. The movements in the 60s and the death of JFK definitely changed the course of history. So that's all the thoughts I have. But I appreciate everybody's participation, questions and comments. Any final thoughts?
I was just reading about this William Lloyd Garrison here on page 139 of 1844 Intellectual Movements.
Yeah.
It says that in the 1850s, when John Brown was making his murderous raids at Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas, and Harper's Ferry, Virginia, William Lloyd Garrison, the leading non-resistant, came out in favor of Brown's actions. This was rather shocking to non-resistants and peacemen alike, for it appeared as though Garrison was a non-resistant in peacetime, but a bloody protagonist in times of conflict. It reminded many of his stand at the time of the Lovejoy assassination of 1837. Garrison supported the Union cause during the Civil War, despite his former inveighing against all government and his public burning of a copy of the Constitution. That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, well, and
Like, no, why?
I mean, he's a radical, and these are radical programs.
Yeah, obviously.
So, I mean, obviously he believed in the principles of the Constitution. The problem was the United States wasn't really following their Constitution. So these are just demonstrations. These are ways of trying to draw attention to the issue. I'm not sure if he was always effective. I don't know if burning the Constitution would be the best way to draw attention to it, to what he was looking for. But yeah, there's definitely some very radical people at this time. We think there's some radical people in our days, but people tend to be a lot more radical. I think Americans are, as far as I'm concerned, they're outrageous in how aggressive they can be, when they believe in something. I don't think I could ever be that aggressive. It'd be pretty tough. But yeah, there was a lot going on. Now, also the other thing that you have happening too is things can get a little bit distorted through the media, even in those days. So, exactly what happened and how things happen sometimes are not always accurate, or people's motives are sometimes misunderstood. We see it happen today, but back then, without television and radio and people having to pass on things more by word of mouth, and the newspapers were much more like Facebook than what we would consider a newspaper. So yeah, so it's hard to know exactly all these different events, how they unfolded, or what the meaning is behind it. But yeah, there was definitely this radical movement, and but I know one thing is that often the people who were pro-slavery would really distort the things that the abolitionists were saying, because one of the things that they saw is that if we followed the abolitionists, we'd have a dissolution of society, that society would fall apart. Because some of the abolitionists were basically almost anarchists, which I think William Lloyd Garrison was, almost like we should just get rid of the government because the governments tend to oppress us. But I don't know.
Yeah, I've said similar things.
I don't know tons about that history. I've read different things and different books at different times in my life on American history. And sometimes you can read one book and get a completely different impression about what happened for the same events, just because you have a writer who has a different view. And there's so much American history. Americans write lots about their history. Americans read a lot of American history, like people who actually are interested in it, but a lot of Americans are. But you can get a lot of revisionist history. And if you're somebody from the South, you would have a completely different take on some of the history than somebody from the North. So, yeah, there was a book I read, I'm trying to remember. It was one of the guys who was one of the lawyers at, what's his name? He's a lawyer at O.J. Simpson's trial, one of the lawyers. He's the Jewish guy. But he wrote a book, because he wrote a book about Israel, but he's also written a lot about early United States history, American history as well. So I read some of his stuff. And that's another thing, if you read about Israel, you can get completely different takes on Israel when they formed as a nation and so forth, depending on the writer. So that's one of the problems with history is there's lots of different views on it. Well, thanks for that. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll close with prayer and end the study, and then we can talk a little bit if you still want to about other things. So let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful that we could meet through the internet and study for a little bit. We just ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit can continue to work in our lives, speak to us, and help us to understand these things. We know that we don't understand everything fully. There's many things that we need to study, and we've also neglected for so many years the study of your word. But we know, Lord, that you're able to teach us, help us yield to you, and help us to give our hearts to you each day. Help us to do the little things that you put before us, to not worry about the big things that we have no control over. And we thank you, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.